All right, yeah. Hey, Jeff.
Hello. Good to be back.
Yeah. I think
again.
this is what?
Let's start again. Take two.
Okay. Hey, Jeff. totally organically.
Yeah.
Hello, Jeffrey.
Shouldn't you be like welcome class back to episode 2, lecture 2.
McNukes.
You're all late for class.
McNukes. Bueller. Yeah. So this is. I'm not going to do a lot of talking because I've recorded it. So Jeff is obviously here. Jeff and I thought we'd do this little experimental thing. We want to hopefully do the next episode in a live stream. But as a sort of a test of the way we'll do it in a live stream, we're going to play a recorded lecture, which I like saying lecture. It's very grandiose. I've recorded the presentation for this episode and just going to pause it when he wants to ask a question, which will be very similar to how the live stream will go, but you guys will be able to watch it live. And then at the end of the episode, or if someone makes a big enough contribution in the middle of the episode, we'll figure out a threshold to pause the episode.
Yeah, this is a very meta modern way of doing things, which is it's a live lecture, but it's also not a live lecture.
Where does the lecture begin and the real world end? So yeah, and Jeff, do you want to say anything before we get going?
Did you want to do a recap also of last lecture, or just
It's in the video. This is the meta of the lecture video.
That's the third level of meta.
Yeah. I'll do a recap of the recap.
Yeah. But anyway, glad to see everybody back who's in the audience. And we're going to continue with Professor Bucklander's lecture series on Carroll Quigley. And so we'll pause momentarily again for questions and answers.
Hey guys. So yeah, it's Tragedy and Hope, the second episode. We're looking at chapter 2, Western Civilization up until 1914, a Bucklander lecture series again, from the Iron Age archives. So just a little quick recap. There are 7 stages of civilization: mixture, gestation, expansion, conflict, universal empire, decay, and invasion. So a mixture, the civilization comes together in the form of 2 or more cultures. Gestation, the ideas behind the civilization form, what Spengler might call their sort of civilizational reference point. Expansion, where the civilization moves out. And conflict, where internal wars sort of divide the civilization, and out of that produces the 5th stage, which is the universal empire, which chugs along for some time until it starts to decay, and finally it's overthrown by invasion. And there's 6 dimensions to cultures and civilizations. There's the intellectual, the religious, the social, the economic, which is the big one that Quigley cares about for the Western civilization, the political, and the military. And of course, again, as I said last time, Quigley says, we can divide these up into more than one way, into more than just these 6 ways, into, as many as we want, really, but these are the 6 that Quigley's working with. So there's 3 parts to today, and the first is what Quigley calls the pattern of change. So there's 6 dimensions up to 1914, and we're going to look at those, and the first one's military. So the way that weapons influence politics is, according to Quigley, is they kind of operate upon 2 different axes. The first is that they can either be used by mass armies or by professional armies. And if they're used by mass sort of citizen armies, states are forced to become more democratic. If they're used by more professional armies, those states can become more authoritarian. In this book, Quigley doesn't talk about it, but there's another dimension, another axis that they exist along, which is offensive and defensive weapons. And he says that the last great defensive weapon was the castle, which allowed Europe to exist in many small political entities. And since the overcoming of the castle by weapons, by gunpowder, you've seen political entities getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Quigley would say that if there's some great defensive leap forward in terms of weaponry, that would allow smaller states to become more viable. There are economies of scale that don't factor into this, but the smaller more defensive weaponry that's viable on county levels will allow counties to operate independently of states. So that's one of the ways. Those are the two ways that they act. And between 1830 and 1930, we see the rise of mass armies, and this goes back before this, but this is the big era in which encouraged democracy to form, and nationalism developed as a way for these democracies, these emerging democracies, to unify. It provided a unitary narrative for them to cohere around. And it's interesting to note that after the First World War, it's the three multinational empires of Europe that fall. Russia, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottomans are the ones that really disintegrate. And this is because, according to Quigley, they can't, in this age of mass armies that are dependent upon democratizing, these three empires are not able to provide a narrative to their peoples, their constituent peoples, in order to unify around. The Germans do really well. The Germans come together and can appeal to this sense of Germanness, and they do really well. Italy is another country that sort of forms around this period out of a sense of nationalism. The English have always been chugging along as an entity, England and the French as well. The English and French are the two historical kingdoms of Europe. In many ways, if you in the history of Europe, there are two kingdoms, and it's England and France, and they're the longest running. They have they're the most prestigious. When you're considering crowns, this is how historians and the church sort of thought about them, that these two countries were the top countries. There was the Holy Roman Empire over there. There was the Byzantine Empire over there. But in terms of kingdoms, the two great crowns, unitary crowns, were England and France. And obviously they step into this period doing really well for themselves. France suffers a defeat under Napoleon, but they very quickly bounce back. In part thanks to, is it Metternich? The bishop, I can't remember his name. I'll put a picture of him here to remind myself. And eventually what happens around 1930 is that ideology comes to replace nationalism. And so you see in the Second World War, the conflict, and post-war, the conflict between ideologies. So we're shifting sometime around 1930, there's a shift from nationalism to ideology. Now, the next big one is, in these six dimensions, is energy. And there's four ways that we can kind of think about how economics develops in this period of 1830 to 1930. There's energy with the adoption of carbon fuels. Prior to that, you have to depend upon animals mainly. Maybe you have a little bit of wind. And before this, there's a move around the year 1000. There's a move from human power to animal power. Around 1000, we're able to properly domesticate draft animals, and then at about 1830, we start to transition into carbon fuels. There's a material leap forward where we become less dependent upon iron, and we're able to use steel more, which is of course stronger. There's organization, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide. And then there's control, and that's the one after that. And you can see this here. This is the organizations. Now, what happens here is the sort of entity that operates in these economic systems. So in the manorial system, you see there's manors, the feudal manor system. Manorialism is often interchangeable with feudalism. Sort of feudalism is sort of what's happening at a sort of a macro scale. Manorialism is feudalism is what's happening at a macro scale between knights and their lieges, and then manorialism is what's happening between peasants and knights. So sort of somewhere around the knight, the land owning knight, there's a transition from manorial. You're transitioning systems from manorialism to feudalism. So feudalism sitting on top, and then as you go through these ages, you see in commercial capitalism, mercantilism, the chartered company dominates. Industrial capitalism has private firms and partnerships. Financial capitalism has corporation and holding companies. We might think of these as like the beginning of conglomerates. And then that moves into monopoly capitalism, which is cartels and trade associations. And then the pluralist economy, which, Quigley says is we're dominated by lobby groups, technocrats, managerialism, sort of dovetailing with managers there. This is sort of the entities that are operating. How the system is controlled, though, there's two alternating mechanisms of control. It's either automatic or conscious. Manorialism is just sort of, it's not market-based, but the system is responding to, is self-regulating. Mercantilism requires much more intervention and management on the part of these companies. They're controlling production in order to maximize profits. The transition to laissez-faire capitalism, though, means that they are now pursuing profits in a market economy. So mercantilism is not capitalism. Mercantilism is controlled markets to maximize profits. Capitalism, the laissez-faire capitalism, is free markets and operating in those free markets. And now we're back into conscious control. Later on, Quigley will say that what the system that we're operating in is neither capitalist, it's neither socialist, and it's neither fascist. We now live with elements of all three, and it's what Quigley calls the mixed economy. But that isn't really for. He doesn't talk about that for a while.
So we'll pause here for a question from the audience. I was just wondering if Quigley gives an account for why it kind of cycles between automatic control and conscious control.
No, not really. What he does talk about how, and I think this comes up later, how every system contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction.
Okay.
And he isn't that worried about control. He's more worried about organization.
Mm-hmm.
So the control is not talked about so much. It's the organization, but each organization contains within itself the ability to destroy itself. And if I were to speculate, there would be some sort of like natural economic rhythm of going back and forth between the two, that the next system in order to supplant the old system, it needs to be automatic or the inverse of what it was in order to justify the change, perhaps. But also as I'm thinking about it, and I don't have the figures in front of me, but roughly the systems of growth line up with the moments of automatic control, whereas the systems of conflict, or the ages of conflict, line up with conscious control. And I don't know whether Quigley did that consciously or not, whether that reflects some sort of capitalistic bias on Quigley's part, that sort of the free market is just better. I don't think Quigley would say that, but that might be a subconscious bias of his.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
And then the other three are the cultural, in which we can call that demographics. So we have an aging population that's urbanizing, and we have emergence of new classes that are defined by their relationship to capital. So the proletariat, the bourgeois, managers, and then there's the religious, which is again sort of secular, materialist, and atheistic, moving to spiritual and religious, and the intellectual, which is going from optimistic and scientific into, in the 20th century, pessimistic and irrational. Those last two, religious and intellectual, that might seem counterintuitive. We're kind of in it. We're still in this sort of like 20th century moment in many ways. And if that seems counterintuitive, I would suggest that you can't see the forest for the trees. You're too close to it, but I think this bears a lot of truth to it. Quigley's analysis here.
Since we're paused, I have a question. Maybe not really a question, but something just I think you can comment on. It's that the whole point about that first section was that why does society organize in these different ways, these different polities, right? And I think in libertarian circles, and we often hear, or even right-wing circles in general, for a long time, we often hear, we should just decentralize, quote unquote. Or it's like, we need to get back to localism and local politics, as if the whole thing was kind of this purely intellectual exercise, that it has no connection to historical developments. And so I think something like this, something like Quigley and something like de Juvenal are really helpful in highlighting that fact that it's not just about worldview or political theory, that there is this element of real world history that goes into why
it's inescapable
organize into
in
these
many
polities.
ways. And I talk a little bit about this in a minute about gold, right? Like the idea of like the gold bros, like we got to get back to gold. I get it. I get the impulse. I'm not sure that it's going to work. The golden age of capitalism, the late 19th century, early 20th century, it worked then, but trying to put it in place now, it probably won't work. And it probably won't work not because you couldn't create a theoretical little community where it did work, Trumptonshire, right? But that Trumptonshire is vulnerable. And there's this like realpolitik problem of like Trumptonshire, the gold standard, all these things that are like conducive to the individual. They're all great, but they require this like game theory problem of not expanding yourself to protect yourself, like and that your neighbors aren't going to invade yourself. And this is sort of like what Mearsheimer talks about, that a country will expand to protect itself. And why does America support Taiwan when Taiwan is so far away from America? Because that is a buffer zone for America in order to protect itself. And there are rings and rings and rings of American buffers. China doesn't have that buffer. It wants that buffer. Russia doesn't have that buffer. It wants that buffer. And so, like, forget what you want, right? Forget it. That's forget what's good for the individual. History doesn't work on what's good for the individual. History works on what's good for nations, and those nations that are able to adopt the latest social or governmental technology in order to make themselves more powerful and can take over their neighbors are the ones that succeed. The ones that remain, virtuous and powerless, unfortunately get swallowed up. How's the non-aggression principle working out for you, bro? The second part is Quigley looks more specifically at the European economic developments. So that's what he calls the chapter. So I've got a few sections here. Commercial capitalism is the first one, and it's sort of their relationship with bankers. And capitalism makes Western civilization the most powerful ever. It's our, by far, it's like the sort of defining characteristic of our civilization that motivates us more than any other. And capitalism here, there's sort of big capitalism and little capitalism. Mercantilism is capitalistic, even though it operates in a controlled market. So though I said previously, it's opposed to laissez-faire capitalism. What we think of as capitalism is really like Quigley's small capitalism, which is laissez-faire capitalism. Big capitalism is, the pursuit of profits, production and the pursuit of profits. So there are 4 stages: commercial, industrial, financial, and monopoly. Each evolved out of the previous system. The transition produced an economic depression, and they harnessed the motivation of self-interest. Beginning in the late medieval period, commercial bankers begin to emerge. And what they are is really a subset of merchants, but with different goals. So the merchants are trading in products, and they start to acquire a lot of currency. And what they then do is groups specializing in the handling of currency develop. And these are the bankers. And they have a different set, they develop a different set of goals, because for bankers, their product is now money. So they're interested in maintaining the value of money, whereas merchants are interested in maintaining the value of products. And then the most powerful amongst the bankers will set themselves apart even more so. And these become involved in foreign trade and exchange. Depending upon what country you're in, they're often known as merchant bankers or investment bankers. Merchant bankers is the British term. Investment bankers is more the American term. And they get really involved in the government. You can think, there's a line of thinking based upon this that goes down a certain road, and I'm sure you know what I'm referring to. Quigley does not go down that road. The bankers are just bankers. They are composed to some extent, the group that you're thinking of, but they're also composed of other groups. And some people think that this is where Quigley pulls back too much. He doesn't get to the point, but I'm not going to go further on. And they get very involved in the government seeking to stabilize, and specifically stabilize via gold, because gold is very important to them in this period. They very much want to maintain a stable exchange rate of gold. And they want to control monetary matters because they don't trust the public or government to pursue stable money. The transition then goes in from commercial capitalism, then goes into industrial capitalism. And we can see this best explained by England's defeat of France in 1815, in that it masters the new financial system of credit, aka the fractional reserve banking under the Bank of England, and is able to punch above its weight, although it does at this time easily have the highest savings rate in the world. And this is for a number of reasons, largely because they develop things in the right order, and they are able to produce a lot of wealth via a prior agrarian revolution, which then landowners save. And the other part of that is the pioneering of the Industrial Revolution, so there's a lot more wealth being generated from that as well. So England is more efficiently able to utilize its resources than France is. Napoleon is very committed to the concept of sound money. Fractional reserve banking, he would have hated, and he functioned as the arch mercantilist. He really didn't like the implications of the system of credit that had developed in England, and part of his strategy was built around bringing England to its knees via bankruptcy. And as I said, England is further aided by this agricultural revolution, which develops wealth, which allows for the for capital to be put into the Industrial Revolution, and yeah, as I said, really allowed England to punch above its weight and to be more efficient with the resources it had. The next move is into financial capitalism, and financial capitalism is the most important one for us to understand. Quigley says it's hidden and mysterious despite its enormous significance, and it's the one that we have the least good understanding of. This is because it is the height of bankers, and they're extremely secretive, and they don't want outsiders to know what they're doing, because they very often have a different agenda than outsiders. They're interested in maintaining the value of money. Outsiders are not. If you're producing anything, you want to get the best price that you can, which means having your goods valued higher, having product valued higher. No one is really producing money. The only people that would really be on side with bankers are gold and silver miners. So I suspect this is how we can explain their secrecy. But they did produce a benefit at least in Quigley's thinking. Again, I emphasize that Quigley is a classical liberal. So when I say that, keep that in mind. So they link national economic systems together, and they do this via a system of gold exchange, which I'll talk about in a little bit. London becomes the heart of this system for 4 reasons. Again, the enormous savings of England, as I said, the oligarchic structure of England, the aristocratic rather than noble structure of England, and the skill of financial manipulation London had developed. So points 2 and 3 are important here. It's a little bit weird to think, again, sort of can't see the forest for the trees. There are still dukes in England. There are still earls. There are still marquesses. The the problem is that those people for a very long time have not had really privileged positions in the country. They didn't really have unique rights that nobility, aristocracy had. Sorry, I should say aristocracy. Nobility. I should say nobility had on the continent. They have titles, but they don't really have any privileges that non-English the English yeoman doesn't have. They sit in the House of Lords. They don't sit in the House of Commons. So when someone produces a new fortune, they can move up into the oligarchic structure quite easily, and become an industrialist in a way that is harder in the rest of the world, or at least in Europe at this time. And they're then also further able to be brought into an aristocratic governing class in a way that the French didn't facilitate, which means that there's a sort of meritocratic system going on here. And you can earn your way into the upper class in England. There are 5 sort of distinguishing features that these international bankers had from everybody else, including other bankers. They're cosmopolitan. Again, they're interested in this sort of international system. The local banker doesn't really care what the exchange rate is with France. He just wants to make money off of deposits, make interest off the deposits. They're very close to government and involved in debt. They love bonds for liquidity. They're all about being able to liquidate assets as fast as possible in order to be more responsive to economic situations. And they're extremely committed to deflation. This is, as I said, they're very committed to the value of money. The more money can buy, the better. That's what deflation is, right? Deflating the value of goods against the price of money. Is that right? Deflating, so that less money buys more goods. And they're extremely secretive, as I said. Further to this, we see a greater distrust of politicians. They're weak. They can't be trusted. This sort of reaches its height at this time underneath these guys, under the financial capitalism. And they want to control money supply for this reason. They really don't like inflation. Quigley, incidentally, thinks inflation is good. He doesn't mean the 10% levels of inflation that we're dealing with now. Quigley means like 3 to 5%. And what 3 to 5% does, or maybe 2 to 4%, maybe somewhere in that window, it prevents capital from getting lazy. If you've got inflation, it keeps money from getting lazy. If you've got healthy inflation, you got to do something with your money, or else risk having it get eroded by inflation. Their commitment to gold create a stable exchange, and I did actually sit down and do the math on this. This is what, and I did this denominated in pounds sterling because that was the currency of the time, and the goal was to get the exchange rate via gold amounted to £1 equaling $4.87, 23.06 francs, or 18.66 Deutschmarks. What this means is that when you have fluctuating markets and you are committed to a stable exchange rate, you're not allowed to do anything about the price of products. So you risk having the prices of things that you have to eat skyrocket because you're maintaining the price, the stable exchange rate. There's a lot to be said about this. There's a lot to be said about gold. I'm not going to go into the detailed exchange rate system that Quigley describes. It's there if you want to read it. I would highly encourage the Gold Bros to check it out because I think it's a quite cogent argument against gold as an exchange rate. I am kind of convinced by Quigley in that the age of gold is past us. We can't go back. We wouldn't want to go back because it would essentially destroy our economy. I'm not making an argument, though. I'm not a financial advisor, so don't take any of this as advice. It's not an argument against investing in gold. I certainly find a gold to be appealing as an investment, but as a monetary denomination, a monetary system denominated on gold, I think is behind us. I don't think we're going to go back to it. I don't think we should go back to it. But that would be an interesting thing to talk about at a later date. I'll have to think more about that. I've got to do some more reading about gold as a gold-backed system and the pros and cons of it. But the bit that I do know, and having read Quigley, I am kind of skeptical about it. But this isn't about what I think anyway. So these powerful bankers gradually take over the central bank and other financial institutions. They take seats on boards and form large conglomerates. And this would be financial capitalism's downfall. Now, this is one of the things about Quigley that I kind of referenced earlier. Everything one of the lessons of Quigley is that everything contains within itself the seeds of its own downfall. I was talking to a guy today, and we were kind of black pilling ourselves into white pills because we're kind of thinking like this can't continue along these trajectories, the situation that we're in 2023, and then I remember I Quigley, and we started talking about it along the lines of like, yeah, but within this system contains the seeds of its own downfall. So I would keep that in mind. That's one of the big lessons that we have from this. Now, it's not talked about so much here. Another one of the big lessons is Quigley says there are 3 big lessons to the book, and he only ever says what one of them is. So the others I'm kind of guessing at here, but when I think about the 3 big lessons, I'll just say them now. One is the scrambling to maintain economic systems that are destructive, and this sort of fighting against booms and busts of capitalism. Quigley's not anti-capitalistic, but he says like we got to learn how to figure out how to do this better, and this is one of the lessons, one of the tragedies of our mismanagement of these systems. The other one is this one that everything contains within itself its own downfall. The third one is really interesting, which is the learning. And these are my 3. These are not Quigley's 3. The first one's Quigley's. The other 2 are mine. The third one is that I've forgotten it now. what is it? Oh, and this is a lesson that's learned under financial capitalism, that you don't need to own in order to control. And Quigley attributes this to financial capitalism in particular. He says that the bankers at this time are the ones who realize we can issue shares without voting power. And I think that realization is communicated throughout the entirety of the system. I would argue that the American empire, as opposed to the British Empire, is more nefarious because it's the American system realizing we don't have to control, we don't have to own colonies or imperial possessions in order to control countries. But we'll come back to that. So Quigley briefly describes the situation before 1914 globally. Britain was a benevolent ruler. I can't emphasize this enough. I've been binging on Peter Zeihan, and he's interesting, but his knowledge of particularly British and French history is awful. It is so embarrassingly bad. And Peter Zeihan paints, he's not like an Anglophobe, but he is not, he does not paint a very nice picture of the British. He lumps them in with everybody else. The British were, as far as Quigley is concerned, as far as all right-thinking people are concerned, the British had an empire unlike any other. It was the best empire that has ever existed. It was incredibly benevolent, and it maintained a system of global trade, basically for any that wanted to engage in it. Something that Peter Zeihan says America does. He doesn't see that Britain did it, for 100 years before America did. British dominance was based on credit, industrial and commercial power above all. And there were a few requirements to be a part of the system. You did have to basically engage in gold-denominated currencies. But it was already dissolving by 1890. 1914 finishes it off. This is another thing, kind of along the lines of like everything contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Everything disappears. Everything changes. That's another kind of lesson of Quigley. If you're in a static system, that actually probably means that something's really bad. It's not moving. Living things move might be a good way. A good way of putting it. And I'll say, I just wanted to reveal my own bias. I was talking to Jeff, who isn't here. We're going to do this a little bit differently, as I'm sure has now been revealed. And we were talking about how Jay Dyer had handled Quigley. I haven't watched Jay Dyer. And Jeff said, Jay Dyer treats Quigley as a bit of a in quite conspiratorial ways. I don't think Quigley was part of any secret society. Quigley was a fanboy, and there's parts of Quigley that I find objectionable, and there are parts of Quigley I don't find objectionable. And what was really weird for me is reading Quigley, going like, why do people not like him? I don't understand what this is. And it's because somewhere around 1930, Quigley's view of the world around 1930, not when he is in 1930, but when he's looking at the world as it was in 1930, he goes, yeah, the British were really good and the Americans were really good. But when I read Quigley, I think he does a really good job of describing a pre-1930 world system which is working, which is nationalist but realist. And the problem is that the transition sometimes around the 1930s, ideology is not just a unifying system, it is a way of looking at the world. And you only need to look at what's his face? I'll remember his name by the time we do this live, but the guy who is everyone hates because he's a realist. Ideology has to go with ideology. by which I mean ideology as a unifying principle dictates an ideological approach to problems. Nationalism as a unifying principle can produce fairly pragmatic solutions and pragmatic approaches to things. So my view is Quigley's right about stuff before 1930, but the beneficial nature of things after 1930, I think he's entirely wrong about. The third part of this chapter is a brief description of the United States up until 1917. So there are two great phases of America. There's 1607 to 1900, 1607 settlement of Jamestown to 1900. America's expanding to fill up the continent westwards. And they're worried about occupying. And from about 1900, they're transitioning. You know, we've filled up everywhere. America's filled up the lower 48. It's got Alaska. It's got Hawaii. It will soon to have some imperial possessions from Spain. The Spanish-American War, incidentally, I think is a pretty defining mark in American history that's underappreciated. America is an empire, and it becomes an empire with the Spanish-American War. But from 1900 on, they're able to industrialize. They're able to switch from, just filling up the space and being agrarian, and they can start focusing on actually industrial development. Quigley splits America up into three regions: the East, which is commercial, later financial and industrial; the West, which is agrarian and later industrial; and the South, which is agrarian. And what happens is there's a sort of rough and tumble around these three regions vying for power. The West kind of becomes the kingmaker. Of course, you have the East and South versus one another in the Civil War. They have very competing visions of what America is going to be. I think there's a lot to be said for the East having a better vision of America, but being overly tyrannical in its application of it. Jefferson wanted a nation of small, landowning yeomen that he could cultivate sort of Roman Republican virtues out of, and having large slave-owning planters amounting to Roman latifundia was not a situation in which you were going to develop a large self-sufficient population of Europeans. Jefferson wanted a nation of Europeans that had Republican virtues. The South was going to produce a system of nobles and aristocrats that were going to be cavalier, and I use that word cavalier with its negative connotations. And Quigley sort of discusses this, right? For the record, I think the South was entirely justified in seceding, but that it shouldn't have tried to export its vision, shouldn't have tried to export slave owning to the West. So what happens is, though, sometime around 1900, the West is sort of cooperating with the East, but sometime around 1900, the West realizes, we need to side with the South because the East doesn't care about our interests. And you see the rise of populism dependent upon the West and the South versus republicanism in the East. And this is sort of the Democratic Party adopting populism is sort of where that turn happens to the Democratic Party that we have today. Between 1898 and 1916, the system realizes that it needs to make some concessions in order to prevent a revolution. America's really worried about a proletarian revolution at this time. There's worries about anarchists, and so the sort of the elite come up with this sort of minor concessions to sort of throw the mob a bone. The liberal press begins to gain ground as an entity, and much of this comes out of a conflict between J.P. Morgan, who is a financial capitalism guy, versus John D. Rockefeller, who's really focused on monopoly capitalism, and culminates in Woodrow Wilson, who is, Quigley says, a minor concession in and of himself, and he and FDR epitomize the expansionary phase to the intensive development, and you can see that with FDR's New Deal, which is for all its pros and cons, is largely focused on developing intensively America.
I don't think there was a slide that distinguished what the difference was between financial capitalism and monopoly capitalism.
That is true, because Quigley doesn't do that in this chapter.
Okay.
Quigley gets into monopoly capitalism as a product of the First World War. And if I said that there was going to be a slide, I apologize, but it's not in this chapter. I did think about that at one point, but he definitely does deal with it, and we definitely will get to it.
Okay, so we should wait, or you want to give us a quick summary?
Yeah, monopoly capitalism is a product of these. So what happens with and again, this is dealt with. We get more information about financial capitalism later. He quickly sort of goes back. What happens with financial capitalism is the things that the bankers are funding, the things that industry wants to start doing are such a large scale that no one individual can afford them, or no one group can afford them. So they need to raise funds, and they have to go to the bankers to do it. And the bankers then get their fingers in all sorts of little pies, and they can start to sort of pull them together and form conglomerates, things that cooperate together. But in doing so, they create things that are of such scale that they can now self-finance. So they don't need the bankers anymore. So these big corporations are able to operate independently and to start sucking up all their competitors. This is then exacerbated by the First World War, where you need things like wool. Now, some of us, when we first hear that, we go, wool, why do we need wool? Wool is used in everything. It's an incredibly important, it's all over the place in the First World War. And you kind of can't operate on a price, like the market for providing wool. The government just has to go out and go, we need as much wool as we can get. Forget the profit motives. We're going to figure this out. Let's just get going. And this sort of incentivizes monopoly capitalism, which is begins and is tied into. It will come. There's another step after monopoly capitalism, which is what we're in now, the mixed economy. But with monopoly capitalism, you start to see the emergence of the manager. And I said this to you, Jeff, in our little group chat. Quigley doesn't mention him in Tragedy and Hope, but he does mention Burnham in the Anglo-American Establishment. So we know Quigley read Burnham. We know that Quigley was familiar with Burnham's. When Quigley talks about managers and managerialism, he's pretty much referencing Burnham. So yeah, monopoly capitalism arises, and it doesn't need the financial aspect. It doesn't need the bankers anymore. The bankers are still there. They're very important in many ways. They still have a significant amount of control, but they're not as powerful as industrialists.
What would you say
But
is a good symbol or emblem of of an organization that emerges out of monopoly capitalism? It's like Bayer Monsanto or something.
yeah, I would say you're going to see them in Germany the most. I think Germany is the most stark in these the mega corporations that you get in Germany that are like nothing over here, or nothing. They're like nothing in America. There are football teams in Germany that are basically company teams. So everyone knows about like Red Bull, whatever German. Well, if you know anything about football or soccer, you'll know like there's the Red Bull team. That's old. There's Bayer Leverkusen, and they're owned by Bayer, right?
Mm.
The big are they pharmaceuticals, Bayer?
Yeah.
And you have like regions, you have like counties, places the size of counties that are dependent upon a single company, and they're gigantic companies. You maybe kind of have something similar. I don't think Quigley ever talks about Edison, but General Electric. But
Mm.
General Electric is not centralized in the way that um, Bayer is in Germany, in a single location. Um, and also because Germany industrializes later than Britain, um, it kind of skips some steps or goes through some steps very fast, which means that towards the end, it's better embodying later stages than Britain is embodying those later stages. So, like one of the things is that, you know, I only know this offhand, right? Is if you go to developing countries, their Wi-Fi is often better because they skip the step of putting in landlines for internet. And so they just waited, and then all of a sudden this new cheap technology popped up, and they just put it everywhere in a way that Americans didn't. And it's sort of like using that as like an analogy. Germany waits, and by the time Germany's really rolling, and also because of the German political culture, it goes straight into monopolies in a big way. So yeah, I would say you'd see it in German companies, but if you want one in America, it would be it would probably be General Electric. General Electric's
Yeah.
like the great American company.
Yeah.
What's the other one? The chemical DuPont. DuPont is pretty big. Unilever. If you want a British one, Unilever. Unilever's big. Unilever's a product, as we know it, is a product of a merger of a British and Dutch company. I'm reluctant to say any oil companies, just because I'm not sure how they fit into monopoly capitalism, but they're there, and there's monopolistic aspects to them, sure. And that is the episode. Next episode, we're going to look at other countries. We're going to look at Russia and the buffer fringe, and these are two different chapters. Russia gets its own chapter. I'm not going to give it its own episode. There will be episodes where I merge chapters. This is one of them, because I want us to cover Quigley, but Quigley from 2023, not Quigley from 1963. I'm not going to treat the Soviets as with the respect that Quigley would give them. I'm not denigrating Russia. I'm not praising Russia. I'm just saying that in 2023, with the benefit of hindsight, we can sort of deal with Russia in the way that we would deal with China. They both deserve sort of the same amount of attention, which is what the buffer fringe is. The buffer fringe is a series of like states that so there'll be the Russian Empire up to 1917, and then the colonies, China and Japan, and Turkey's in there too. And it's going to cover about 1918 to 1939. So that is the end of this episode. That is the end of this recording. And Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, there was a lot there.
There are some really long chapters. Like, at the moment, I'm prepping the episode on the First World War. I'm not going to talk about the strategies, the campaigns in the First World War, because you can get that anywhere. I'll be focusing on like what I think, the insights I think that are unique to Quigley, or that are like significant to Quigley. And this one had a lot of stuff that I think is underappreciated.
Mhm.
The sort of the late Victorian age, I don't think we've got a really good grasp on it. And so this is a longer one because I thought that there was a lot in this chapter. This was one chapter. I don't want to give, as I said, I don't want to give every chapter its own episode, but I want every episode to be at least one chapter. I didn't want to chop this up into 2 episodes.
One thing that I can certainly appreciate about Quigley is that do you know this book, A History of Central Banking by Stephen Goodson?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Okay. Well, I think not that it's a bad book, and maybe there's a lot of important material in there as well, but what you get from a lot of these types of history books is this kind of like one-sided good guys versus bad guys type of dichotomy set up. So Goodson's whole thing is he basically tracks all of these world leaders and their war against central banking. So Napoleon's war was really a war against central banking, and then Hitler's war was really a war against central banking, and et cetera, et cetera. The Civil War, American Civil War, was ultimately reducible to a war against central banking, and so on and so forth. And with Quigley, there seems to be a lot more detail and nuance there that I appreciate.
I never thought, reading Quigley, that he was being unfair.
Mhm.
I think he's got his ideological commitments, and as I said in the episode, I'm with him up till 1930, and then after 1930, I think his descriptions are accurate. But where he praises, I don't. And part of the way that he's fair and balanced, though, is he talks about everything. He is not just doing central banking, right? He's doing lots and lots of stuff. I think he's fair. I think he's fair. I mean, where I disagree with him, it's not because I think that like he's been unfair.
And so the parts that you disagree with him, is that going to be something that we're going to see a lot of in the next episode?
No, not the next
But the
episode.
next one, right?
I don't even know if it's there. So my tome. So there are 20 chapters in Tragedy and Hope. We've now done 2. The next episode will bring us. We'll do 3 and 4. I will probably do chapters 5 and 6, which is the First World War and Versailles, and the diplomatic system, as an episode. It depends how much. I think that's doable. But in my book, I highlighted a couple of chapters as being specifically like really important. And the first chapter that's really important is chapter 7, which is Finance, Commercial Policy, and Business Activity from 1897 to 1947. So that's a big one. But I think where I really start to disagree with Quigley is about halfway, which is there's a chapter about Britain and the background to appeasement. So, okay, so half the book is the first 13 chapters. The last 7 chapters are the second half. By the second half, I disagree with Quigley on a number of things. I can't remember what, though, at the moment, off the top of my head. But it is this sort of general sort of liberal boomer attitude of America. Like, oh, this is fine. This is great. Like, Quigley is decent because he gives credit to the British in the way that, like, liberal boomers don't. But he's still like, yeah, America's awesome and it's working perfectly fine. And anyone can come and be an American and et cetera, and all the sort of liberal assumptions. Quigley's a liberal.
Mm-hmm.
Quigley is a JFK type liberal.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we could wrap up today's lecture here, and I look forward to the next one.